Well, the first thing I'm going to do is to bow and also to say a big thank you to our audience. I'm going to thank them for sharing presence with with us today. And today I am very, very honored and very blessed to welcome to the Simply Inspired podcast. Today is episode 466. And I'm very, very honored to welcome to the podcast Stephen Mugen Snyder Sensei. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that the right way. An esteemed and world-renowned Buddhist teacher and practitioner across multiple traditions, an author of 5 books, someone who has been practicing meditation for around about 50 years, I believe, meditation broadly, as well as practicing in different traditions, the Zen tradition for around 20 years, the Theravāda tradition for a long time as well. Mugen, I guess I'll call you Mugen today, also has associations with the Tibetan tradition as well, the Western non-dual tradition, particularly in the Diamond Heart program, where he spent 15 years there and completed the teacher training, as I understand it. Also an ordained interfaith minister, and as I've mentioned, author of 5 books, co-author of Practicing the Jhanas, author of a book about stress reduction for the legal profession, much needed in the world today, author of Buddhist Heart on the heart practices of the Theravāda tradition and demystifying awakening as well. I'm missing one here. Oh, yes. And most
Trust
recently,
and Awakening.
yes, Trust and Awakening. Yes, that's right. Translation of 7th century poem. So, in short, those are a few accolades there. But in short, Mugen is a person who contributes positively to the lives of so many people around the world. I'm going to sum it up like that. Somebody who has a positive impact on so many people around the world. And Mugen will have his own definitions for that in his own words. But I'm just summing it up that way. As I've mentioned, a few accolades there, and such an honor to be here with you today, truly. So, once again, I will bow and thank you so much for making the time for this morning. Much
My,
appreciated.
my pleasure, Liam. Nice to be with you. And I will say my sixth book actually came out this week called Liberating the Self.
Yes, yes, it did. Yes, it liberated itself, and we will talk more about that shortly, very, very shortly. But as I mentioned to you, there's a few different topics here that I'd like to touch on. Some regarding your life, some regarding Buddhist teachings on a broader perspective. But I would like to touch on also your beginnings in Buddhism. Now, although this is a simple place to start, I would like to go back in time because people look at where you are now and the respect, the renown, everything you've achieved, the depth of your practice, and rightly so. However, as I mentioned, as soon as we were mentioning demystifying awakening, then I also think demystifying teachers themselves can be valuable from a certain perspective. So that's my reason for asking about where Buddhism began for you. I've come across somewhere along the line that you spent at least a portion of your childhood in Guam, or you have an association to Guam. I'm not sure for how long. You have to fill me in on that. But I was wondering if you were exposed to Buddhism and other Eastern traditions as a child in that context, or if it came from somewhere else. But may we begin with your first exposure to Buddhism, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, the first exposure I had, I did grow up on Guam with some time in Hawaii as well. My father worked for the airlines, and so we would travel generally once or twice a year to Japan. I'm not sure if he was doing business or it was just a little pleasure trip for us. I think he did some business there. But that was where I was first exposed to Buddhism by way of seeing not only the temples in Tokyo, but also I had a pretty impactful experience at 3, seeing a Zen monk jogging down the sidewalk, I suspect late for some appointment, and seeing the shaved head, which virtually nobody had in those days in the West, and seeing the black robes flapping behind him as he was jogging down the sidewalk was quite impactful for me. And the felt sense for me was a witnessing of myself. The experience was my saying to myself, there I am, without even knowing what that meant. And it was really quite impactful and stayed with me until later in my teen years, going through the normal teen angst. I decided I needed to have some type of spirituality in my life, and that's where I really recalled that memory and the impact of it. And I began trying to source books in English on Buddhism, of which there were very few, but I was able to find a few, and found some instruction on meditation, and found a way to get a cushion. And so I began to meditate then at age 19.
Wonderful. Now, that's an interesting point that you've made there. Pre-internet, that era, finding knowledge on Buddhism, finding books with practical application, finding anything to study really in English must have taken quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of dedication. So you found those at the library. Was there a particular book or a particular teacher that you gravitated towards at that time, or were you already exploring different traditions at that time? If that makes sense. I really would like to get a
Mm,
feel for those earliest years, as I've already said, because it's immensely valuable to people beginning their practice today. That's
sure.
true.
I found one book that was called something like The Fragrant Lotus, and it was kind of an overview book. Every chapter was about a different sect of Buddhism. And reading the book, I resonated with the book. I could tell that Buddhism appealed to me and it made sense to me. But when I read the Zen chapter, that really felt like home. I just felt such a kinship for the information and the presentation. And I was able shortly thereafter to get a copy of a book, Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau. And that book not only contains some awakening stories, which interestingly I have in my new book, Liberating the Self. I've got about 10 student awakening stories, which was very inspirational to read in Three Pillars of Zen. But he also included information on koans and how to meditate. And so from that book, I began counting breaths, which is a preliminary concentration meditation practice. And I did that for about 2 years and really helped me develop pretty good quality meditative concentration, which then I was able to use in other applications. And that started my journey with Zen, which has been almost 50 years now that I've been practicing in the Zen tradition. And as you say, I spent about 20 years in the Theravādan tradition and some years in Tibetan Buddhism, Western non-dual, and diamond approach, which I found very useful on my path, working with the psychological spiritual interface. I did do the teacher training, did not become a Diamond Heart teacher, but I did do the training that they offered.
Wonderful. Absolutely. It's remarkable. And I have to ask as well, those early years, did you ever have the expectations one way or another of, well, first of all, there's a couple of ironies here, Mugen. First of all, interviewing a Buddhist teacher about self is kind of ironic in itself in terms of about, your identity, your life from that perception, but also something that's so grounded in the present moment. When I'm asking about future expectations, that also has an irony. But I am still curious to know if you ever had expectations that that would be where you would spend the rest of your life, basically, if you would still be doing this 50 years later, or if at the time you were just taking it one step at a time as well. Again, the same philosophy behind this, people beginning their practice, and then from this we'll move on into some other things. But I
Mhm.
was just curious when you found your home, as you mentioned with that book, if you knew at that time it would stay your home, or if it only felt right at that present moment, if that makes sense.
Mhm. I think when I read the books, I knew I was attracted to it and I could see it was something that would be beneficial to me in the immediate application. But when the first time I meditated, which I could only meditate about 5 minutes, that was as much as my body and mind could manage. But I felt a kind of grounding. The way I described it at the time was I felt like my grounding plug was plugged in when I sat. And so I knew that I would continue sitting, and I suspected I would sit for the rest of my life. I would meditate for the rest of my life based upon that sense. And even now when I meditate, I don't have expectations in meditation. I meditate, and whatever arises is what's appropriate for the meditation. But I enjoy meditating is really what the motivation is now, rather than getting anywhere or cultivating any kind of experience. It's simply being present to what's unfolding in this moment.
Wonderful. I was hoping that would come up. I was hoping that that clarification would come up actually. So thank you very, very much with this. Now, I would like to progress forward a little bit into some of your early work with teachers in terms of the fact that we are talking here about books and about practices you were doing yourself. I've even come across somewhere you were practicing in the early days with a red light, and I came across that
Oh,
in an interview that you did recently, which actually makes a lot of sense. But when we move past some of those things into actually working with your earliest teachers, retreats, seminars, or different gatherings that you went to. I would like to talk about that process, but I would like to talk about that process also from the framing not only of how particular people helped you at that time, but also the changes that you began to experience in day-to-day life in those early years in terms of your interactions with people, in terms of your work, and any areas of life that you feel it's relevant to mention and appropriate to mention. Again, people starting off in their practices, I think that this is of deep value to them. So may we talk about that next step in the process of actually going to retreats, going to work with teachers hands-on, and how that developed for you, please?
sure. Well, I'll say one thing. When I started meditating, I didn't tell anybody I was meditating. I was keenly aware that it was valuable to me. I didn't know completely if I would stay with it. I felt I would, but being a teenager, my attention would move pretty quickly sometimes from things that seemed to have a lot of interest. So I think just to not create a situation where if somebody checked back with me and I'd say, oh no, I'm not meditating anymore, I didn't want to have that conversation. So I just didn't tell anyone. And probably about a year or 18 months into meditation practice, people began commenting on my composure, my ease, my relaxation being around me. That at work I didn't get that flustered and would stay calm and and so this was new information to me. This was not something people typically shared with me as a teenager. So for people to say you just have a calm presence about you and I feel good when I'm around you, things like that. Uh, and that was really great because it let me see without my saying anything, people were seeing a difference in my behavior and in my, I guess, tone as a person. So that was validating to the process. Finding a teacher, I looked around a bit. I was in San Francisco at the time, and San Francisco Zen Center had started a few years before. When I did visit there, I did a little bit of activity at San Francisco Zen Center, but I found it to be, I called it high church. It was kind of too fancy, too ornate for my taste. They had all these fancy robes from Japan, and there was something about it that just seemed too complex to me. I wanted something simpler, and so that didn't feel like a fit at the time. And I ended up connecting with a teacher, Kenneth Roshi, who founded Shasta Abbey in Northern California, and worked with her organization, mostly with other teachers rather than her specifically. But I did retreat there, and I did Jukai. I took the precepts from her, and did a number of short retreats, day longs, couple day retreats. That was pretty common for a while. And then at some point, I began doing probably four what are called sesshin. They're 7 day retreats in the Zen tradition. I would average four a year of those. And I maintained doing four retreats a year in the different traditions I practiced in up until a few years ago. I only stopped attending probably 3 or 4 years ago. And now, because of teaching as much as I do, I don't attend retreats as a student any longer. Even though I work with my teachers still, I don't attend other retreats.
Absolutely. So that's the process. It makes a lot of sense. But the concept of teachers, obviously, being an esteemed teacher yourself, working with different teachers and so forth, leads me to one of the bigger picture topics that I mentioned we may touch on actually. Um, Even though I was thinking of doing this a little later, but actually I feel that actually we've come to it now, is how you define the role of a teacher in Buddhism. And although that's a very broad topic, I feel that this naturally leads into how to find good teachers, how to avoid the not so good ones, unfortunately, who are out there, but more to how to find the good ones, but also how you define that role, because I will expand into this topic shortly of your decision to become a teacher as well. As it's one thing to learn the practices for yourself, it's another thing to share them with
Mhm.
the world. But before we get into that, I would like to define for anyone who's not clear your personal interpretation of what it means to be a teacher in Buddhism, please.
I think within our spiritual journey, a lot of the early years are really focused within. We're learning the meditation, we're letting the meditations have a certain impact on our life and our being. And at some point, that flow, that inward flow, begins to also flow out, meaning we get sort of full enough that there gets to be an overflow. And there are some people who have a proclivity and a calling to be teachers. I had a kind of a general vague sense of that in the Zen tradition that I was in at the time when I was a young student. There was some desire by the students to want to ordain and become teachers. And so there was a little bit of competition trying to look good for the head teacher to try to be advanced. And I had a couple opportunities to develop as a teacher with different groups, but the overall just it didn't feel like it was the right fit. Something was just a little bit off, even though I respected the teachers and got a lot from practicing with them. It just wasn't quite the home I was looking for. And so that ended up taking its own journey. But I think a teacher is someone really who can guide. You want to find a teacher who has sufficient experience that they can support pretty much wherever you are in your path. And ideally, you want a teacher who's worked with other teachers, who's had confirmed awakening experiences. And I'm a big advocate and fan of lineage teachers. I think there are a lot of teachers out there who are more self-proclaimed, and some of them could be good teachers, and some of them, in my view, weren't quite at the fullness of maturity to teach. They started a little too soon. And the other thing I think with a teacher, like my Zen teacher and I at this point have more of a peer relationship, but we still work together. We still practice together and communicate and process together. So I think there's something important about teachers working with other teachers, because we all need to still be students and have someone to help us recognize if there's issues coming up or practice points that need clarification. To have someone to help do that is really valuable, because with meditation, like anything else in life, when we're experiencing it, it's different. And if it's the first time we've experienced it, we don't have a lot of knowledge. So being new to the experience, we're not sure, if we're in a strange city, should we go left or right? Should we try to find a hotel or a restaurant? And with a teacher who's experienced, they can say, okay, let's look and see where we are. What's the next step you need to take? So really focusing people, and a lot of my function as a teacher is also validating people's experiences. I want them to recognize when they're having experiences what it is, so that when it arises again, they can recognize it rather than just not know what it is. So it also builds their confidence as they, I can say to them, this is an experience of absence or emptiness, or this is an experience of unity or love. Then they know what they're experiencing too, and they can have it, the experience can have a name and sort of a location. And so I think that's part of the teacher function as well. And that's part of what's motivating me to write the books, to help explain, to map, to give people some markers on practice. And also, it's intended for the future teachers in this lineage to be able to offer their teaching within that context, that framework.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's very, very, very valuable for people's understanding. But there's a second aspect to that, Mugen, that I would like to touch on. And when I mention this, um, I mean this respectfully, and I actually mean this as a compliment, but maybe it's not a question you get too often. When I sit down with you, you do have a lovely energy, by the way, going back to what people said earlier about the calm feeling and all of that. And actually, even though I've done over 400 of these, I was a little bit nervous because of not having time to prepare enough and everything, but I needn't have been. And the reason I say that is to say that despite the fact you are internationally renowned and respected and a published author and all of these kinds of things, you obviously stay very humble and centered, for want of a better term. And although that might seem uh, to a certain extent an obvious aspect of the practices, I understand that it's not necessarily the case for everyone. I won't get into that. And I'm curious, as a practitioner, how you avoid the trap of becoming basically too invested in your role as a teacher the other way. Because, I mean, we were talking just now about your beginnings, but now if we look at 50 years, you've been practicing, you've been teaching for many years, as I mentioned, and sharing this wisdom in one way or another. As I understand, you're authorized in several traditions, as I've mentioned, and you practiced even more than that. So there definitely is an element that strikes me, if I were to try and put myself in your shoes a little bit, to what degree that's possible. I'm not sure, of staying. Um, is detached the right word? In other words, not becoming too invested, caring, but not becoming too invested in your role and too comfortable in your role. And that's why I precursored that by saying I do mean this respectfully, because you
Mhm.
have done that, but I'm curious how you've maintained that. So I feel that will be interesting for people. May we go a little bit into that topic, please, Mugen? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's an important question too. I think there's a couple of components here. One is relating to realization itself. In my book, Demystifying Awakening, I map both the Theravāda Buddhist four stages of awakening and the Zen three stages of awakening. And within that, within the Zen model, the third stage, first is Kensho, which is pretty much a generic awakening, but definitely a first awakening. A deeper awakening, we use the term Satori in this lineage. And then what's called the final awakening, which is not a final awakening, is called Daigo Tete. And that means something like great awakening. or large awakening. One of the components of the Daigo Teite is that the sense of self drops permanently. So there isn't a sense of me in the ordinary way that people relate to themselves. If I'm asked who I am, the most common answer I give is I don't know. I mean, literally, I can check in and I have no idea who or what I am. So that's part of it. And the other part is that being a teacher, it's a function, and it's not something that me as a personality, as an individual, am doing. I'm a conduit for the source, the absolute. And part of what happens in the teacher-student relationship is there's a harmonization of the absolute. So when I do one-on-ones with students, or even you and I having this time together, there's a way that the absolute is harmonizing itself in the field, in the connection you and I have. So, you may be aware, you may be not, but you may be finding your energy doing some small shifts while we're interacting. And I'm not doing anything. There's no technique on my part, but it's the way the absolute moves through me. So part of it is recognizing being a teacher, I believe, is being a servant to the truth. So our obligation as teachers are to be as clear and truthful as we can be with students, and also support them and help when they get into difficult times. And for students also, I am not shy about recommending someone consider doing therapy. Some of those in the UK and Europe have more reluctance around that. For Americans, it's a pretty common experience to seek out therapy. So if I mention it to an American, that wouldn't be too surprising. But I've had some of the Europeans have strong reactions to that suggestion. But we sometimes just have had traumatic experiences happen that we can't resolve on our own. We need an objective professional to help us process through and really refine and strengthen the ego structure, because we need a really strong ego structure before we can transcend the ego structure. If we have a weak or shaky or cracked egoic structure, trying to do spiritual practice can cause further cracks. So we want to make sure that people have a stability as well when they begin to do deep practice.
Makes a lot of sense. I do feel the energy shifts, by the way, as soon as you mentioned that, just so I don't forget to say so, as partly what I was referring to earlier. I tell you what, I'm definitely going to listen to this back and make some notes, because although I'm taking it in now, there's so much here that I'm personally learning. I mean, it's not why I do this, but just so you know, I would like to say thank you very much for that. Um, a couple of things here. Therapy, that's a very interesting point, and that is actually something that I had noted to mention, of the integration of Buddhism and traditional Western psychology, for want of a better term, that this kind of thing. It's quite a broad topic, but I would like to get a few of your thoughts, please, on that intersection of how the two can work together. It has been seen that they can work together. There's a number of similarities. But when you mentioned that about therapy, I feel that's a very interesting topic to go into, including the fact that being a teacher and being a therapist, as in being a Buddhist teacher and being a traditional therapist, I can also see some overlaps there, some differences, but certainly a few overlaps as well. So I don't really have a very narrow question with this, to be honest with you, Mugen, but it's an interesting topic to expand upon, please, if we may, of the connection between psychology and Buddhist practices, something that needs to be, I guess you could say, demystified in its own.
Right. Well, I think for a lot of people, there can be a reaction when therapy is suggested of some shame, that something's not right with me or I'm broken in some fashion. And really it's just there are issues that we have. If we find ourselves overreacting regularly to certain kinds of triggers and we're aware of it and we can't do anything about it, we can't change our reactivity, that's a sign that we need some therapeutic assistance because there's something that's stuck, that's snagged, somehow uh, is becoming a problem. And it's just, as I say, it's just helpful. I have a lot of students that are therapists, and so finding therapists isn't so hard for students. But working with a therapist can be really useful. Again, it therapy is really helping support a healthy egoic structuring, and and that's essential. Not everybody needs therapy. Some people either have had lives that have been pretty smooth and relatively happy, where they don't really have significant traumas in their childhood, and other people have had very difficult childhoods. I mean, of all varieties, and were such that there's issues around how they learned to emotionally attach to the caregivers. They didn't have good modeling or mirroring on how to emotionally, psychologically attach to people. What's the healthy balance and distance and whatnot. And so that's something that's very helpful to cultivate. Because, and the reason really for this, Liam, is that however we are with our early caregivers seems to be the relationship we project onto the source, onto the absolute. So this is where it becomes quite important how we relate to our caregivers, how our early life was structured, because that's the template we're going to start working with when we start making contact with the absolute. So we want to have the most mature relationship we can, and that's where therapy may come in. And there are people who I don't think are suitable for spiritual work. If somebody has a significant mental illness, uh, typically it doesn't work to do deep spiritual practice. Doing light meditation at home might be very useful, but I wouldn't want to encourage someone like that to do a multi-week intense retreat because it puts a lot of pressure on our psychology, and we don't want to have any breaks or any damage to be done. So we want to, use our wisdom as best we can to offer retreats to people who are ready and who have the stability to participate fully.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense, actually. And also, by the way, that leads me to something here which I'd like to touch on again regarding your role as a teacher and everything that you do. And again, I'm only saying this to illustrate a point, hopefully, and not to probe into anything too personal. But people look at a teacher such as yourself and assume, I think, that everything is plain sailing. In other words, that you've always been happy and content with your role and everything is okay and all of this. And obviously, one of the important things I would say in my experience, which is obviously a lot more limited than your own, but I still feel compelled to say, is that it's not always like that. And actually, some of the biggest shifts that I've had in my own life of being in day-to-day life, they haven't been on the cushion. They've been some have certainly been there, but a lot have definitely been in the midst of conflict and supposedly stressful experiences from a certain perspective, or things that would have once triggered me the most, and all of this kind of thing. And I'm curious to translate that to you in terms of what have been some of the more difficult times in your life that you feel it's appropriate to mention, and how you not only overcame them, but transformed them through the practices. Again, I feel that this is very relevant because people seem to have the expectation that they'll engage with spiritual practices and it's all bliss, but obviously life is life, and it's very much how we respond to life. So,
Hmm.
in terms of that, in terms of maybe if there's a relevant experience that you feel comfortable sharing that was basically terrible from a normal perception, but how the practices helped you to transform that, I feel that could be very valuable, and that's very much something that came to me when I was preparing the questions like that. When we're talking about the absolute, I don't even know where it came
Hmm.
from, but I knew I had to ask it. So there we are. In your own words, please. Thank you.
Sure. Well, we need to understand that the source of all creation manifestation, what I call the absolute, is unconditioned. When I say unconditioned, that means there's no birth, decay, or death. It's always in existence. It always has been in existence. It always will be in existence. There's no decay or death as part of the unconditioned, the absolute. The world we live in, our bodies, the world around us is conditioned. There's a creation, there's a birth, there's a decay, there's an ending, a death, a decomposition of some form. And so anything that lives in a conditioned world is going to experience some level of disappointment, some level of suffering, because there's going to be loss. There's the loss of people in our lives, people die, relationships change, there's divorce, there's strained family relationships, there's work issues, health issues. So there's lots of places for humans to have suffering. And the practice of the spiritual life is not to eliminate the suffering. That's a common misunderstanding. But what we're learning through a spiritual practice is how to meet the suffering, the natural suffering of the conditioned world, what we call dukkha in Buddhism, which means dissatisfactoriness or suffering. And so understanding that the human life is going to be suffering. I've had some health issues. I've had several head injuries and several from car accidents. People ran into me. And the meditation was critical in my recovery from those accidents. I had some accidents that were extremely painful. I lost some abilities I had to relearn. So the meditation helped me stay calm, stay in touch with warm heartedness, which let me accept more where I was and work with it. So I think there's lots of ways we can apply this. I've certainly had family members die, so working with that loss as well helps to have a spiritual practice. So it's again, it's an expected part of the path. We can't change that. Like I tell people, I view this body as like the car that I was issued for this lifetime. The tires may be bald, the bumper may be hanging off by hanging on by a thread, but this is the car I was issued. This is the body I have. So if it has illness or has problems, that's just part of this body. That's part of the conditioned functioning of this body. So I don't expect perfection. I don't expect not to suffer, but I've learned over the years how to meet and be with the suffering, to be intimate with it, to not run away from it. Because we can learn a lot from our suffering and our reaction to the suffering. It can be a great teacher if we pay attention.
It's actually a very inspirational topic, and everything that you share is, by the way. But that I wasn't aware of that. So, if you don't mind me asking, and bear in mind that my channel is called Simply Inspired, so I started off with, funny enough, with those kinds of stories before doing spiritual talks of people, learning to walk again or recovering from serious injury and so forth. So, if you don't mind me asking, I hope it's appropriate to do so. You were hit in a sense like run over by a car, and you had to learn to regain certain functionality. Am I interpreting that the correct way, please? I ask this
Yeah.
respectfully because it's personal, but also.
Yeah. I had several head injuries. A couple. I wasn't walking when I was hit by a car. My car was hit,
Okay.
but I had some other accidents, and in there was a loss of function each time it happened. Certain skills were either difficult or impossible to find. I had to either relearn or find a new way of doing things. Like even today, I can't read a lot. Even though I write books, I can't sit down and read one of my books from cover to cover. I would have to read for 30 to 60 minutes, take a break for some, maybe a few hours, come back, read a little bit. So if somebody sends me a book to read, I tell them, look, this may take me weeks or months to get through. And that's just part of my system now. So it's also accepting, as we age, our body is going to have less functionality in certain areas. My glasses get stronger every time I go to the eye doctor. I have health issues that I need to pay attention to. So it's the normal aging that we have to deal with as well. It's again, the spiritual life isn't, the goal isn't perfection. The goal is authenticity. So being real in our own lives as fully as we can and recognizing we're going to make mistakes. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to misunderstand. And that's part of being a human in a conditioned world. So we expect that but we learn to talk about it. This is how I'm feeling in this relationship with you, Liam. I'm wondering what your side of this is. So having real conversations with people, that's part of what we're learning. In my new book, Liberating the Self, one of the aspects of the book is I talk about how to work with difficult emotions, things like envy, hatred, anger, and how to trace them back to the vulnerability preceding that reactivity. And from abiding in the vulnerability, that can open up to the quality of the absolute that's actually the antidote for that situation. So, for example, if we were to work with envy and jealousy, if we traced it back to the vulnerability preceding the reaction of envy, we would find some type of loss, some type of hunger and aching, something that felt empty and wanted to be filled. And by staying with that, we would open to the unconditioned, unborn love of the Absolute, because that's the antidote. When we're in contact with that pure love of the Absolute, we don't need someone else to fill us up. We don't need a partner to make us feel better. We feel better because we're in contact with the source, and it has unlimited supplies. So this is one of the ways we work with these difficult issues as humans. There's ways to bring it into our spiritual life and path.
That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate the candor there in terms of something that is quite personal with regards to the accident. I mean, it. This is why I've tried to set out today to hopefully bring up a few topics that people don't hear every day from teachers such as yourself. Maybe I've succeeded, maybe I haven't. I mean, look, to touch on what you mentioned there about my side of it, I'm at the stage of pretty much, I think I'm a little bit past the red light stage that you had, but I'm certainly not at the stage that you're at now. I'm more at the stage of when you were counting the breaths. You know, you did the 2 years counting the breaths. I'm sort of largely self-taught. I know this is the path for me, but at the same time, it's certainly taken some figuring out. It's taken a lot of unpacking
Mhm.
trauma that you mentioned earlier. It's been a long process as to how I got there. And so that's why then deepening my understanding. If I have a supposedly personal agenda, then really it's the fact that I learn as I go from these kinds of talks. But really, I create the interviews. I have always created the interviews as a form of service to people, which I never intentionally set out to do. So my background was in journalism, and essentially the interviews were at the time going to be a temporary outcropping of that. But originally, I had the messages from people saying, "Well, look, Liam, you created this talk, and it inspired me not to give up on life, and it inspired me to, think about things differently, experience things differently." And I thought, well, okay, I need to keep doing this then, and I run this alongside my other businesses. As soon as you're an author, at the moment I'm compiling some of my interviews into a book format, which I'm hoping to publish hopefully this year. I'm in negotiations for that. But it's been a path, as soon as we're talking about the absolute, and I mean, I like that term, I've been calling it the universe, but the synchronicity of these experiences that I never planned, as soon as you were talking earlier about the egoic nature of things, um, that was going in a different direction, but life has taken me in this direction, which is why I thought it was interesting when you said about the story as a 3-year old when you saw that monk running. My first experience with the monk was something similar, except I was older than that. I was in my teenage years, and I was struck by, I guess, what at that time I would have interpreted as joy, in the sense that this person had, even though he only passed me on the street, I was aware he had a sense of joy that I hadn't really seen in anyone else. It was very simple. I'd worked with celebrities and, people who supposedly have everything in our conditioned world, a lot of whom were quite miserable or stressed, not all of them.
Mhm.
And he was very, whether it's joy or peace, equanimity, people use these different words. And so for me at the time, it was a very primitive awareness of, well, I want to find out what that is. And I began to develop from there. So to answer your question, that's why I do this. Now, as we come up on the hour, I'd like to touch on one, maybe two other topics, and we'll probably wrap up on the hour. I like to keep them to about an hour so that people can digest this. If someone wants to listen and make notes or re-listen back to it, it's not too long out of a day, in order to do that. I would like to touch on your writing aspect, your authorship aspect of your life a little bit more, only because what you said earlier about the legacy and the lineage, leaving books for future generations to learn from and so forth. I would like to touch on the creative process of writing and how that connects with the mindful practices. Also, how that connects with the absolute. I'm going to use that term now. Um, in terms of, I don't know how far you will go into this, my friend, but if you don't mind me asking, how much of it is coming from your supposed sense of self, as in the subconscious mind, and how much of it is coming from, shall we say, a higher inspiration, however we determine that, including obviously there are the practical aspects of the teachings, but the writing process for you, the authorship process for you, what is it like? How does it work? How does inspiration come to you? If we may touch on that, I do
Mhm.
feel that will also be valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for most of my books, there's been a kind of revealing by the absolute, where several of them I've woken up during the night or in the morning, and I'll have a conceptual table of contents, for example, for a book, and it'll be some aspect of practice, and I'll realize, oh, okay, that's a piece that can be put together in a book. And so I generally write regularly, meaning I probably 4 or 5 days a week I spend some time writing, whether it's 15 minutes or an hour, but I try to put in regular time. And most of the books are heavily influenced by the absolute. So as I'm writing, I'm feeling the absolute in whatever topic I'm writing about. And I'm trying to stay open and sensitive to where I can feel some of the nuance. So I try really hard to language what I'm experiencing as closely as possible. And we have to understand that the absolute is non-conceptual. So when we go deeply enough in there, we not only won't have a sense of self, we also won't have any thoughts. And so that's part of meditation is learning how to meditate on a non-conceptual level, to drop beneath the concepts and sit with the non-conceptual experience. So so I feel as though it's not so much that I'm taking dictation. It's not like the words are coming from the absolute, but the practice is coming from the absolute. The territory I'm writing about, I can feel and sense. And again, that's communicating in certain ways that give nuance. I mean, I also have a team. I have an editor. I've had the same editor for all my books, and I have some of the same people that work on every book. So I know everybody, they know me. So we have a rhythm when it comes time for the book to be edited and go through proofreading and all that. And they always make it better, what I write. So so I think it's that way. And like right now I'm working on a book and I've got a couple more books in mind that I'd like to do. I think that'll probably be the conclusion of my books. So maybe three more books will be it. But I've said that before, and I've been wrong. So who knows? But anyway, but as I say, the books are important, I think, to both communicate practice areas that aren't communicated so much, and I try to find practices. I I tell people I'm not a traditional teacher. If you want a traditional Theravādan Buddhist or Zen teacher, I'm not it. I mix and match from the different traditions. I experiment a lot with my students. I run a couple of online groups that meet for a day a month, and I do day longs throughout the year, and of course in-person retreats. And I'm constantly experimenting, trying to find new ways to help people experience different things. And it's been really interesting. I had a call with a student today who had a new way. He had an experience of linking up two meditations that normally wouldn't go together, but he found a way that it just opened one into the other, and that was new information. I thought it was possible, but I hadn't seen anybody have that experience yet. So that tells me that's something I can add into the teaching now. I can have people explore it and see if other people that becomes an easier way in to contacting certain qualities of the absolute.
Absolutely. Wow. That makes a lot of sense as well, and it's a nice way to close out, I think. Before you go, also, if people would like to reach out to you directly for retreats and some of the things you offer, or at least to connect with you and to see if you sort of gel with them, for want of a better term, and vice versa. Very important. It is still relevant because some people will listen to this and take away from it more indirectly in digital format as today. But I do feel that some people will feel that pull in themselves to connect with you more personally. And if that happens, and if it's appropriate for that to happen, we need a sort of ethical plug for how people can reach out to you because you are very accessible. I mean, the only other thing I will say is I attempt to reach out to a certain number of teachers, and some of them answer, some of them don't. But the rates of accessibility do seem to vary somewhat, and I mean that in a good way because you have the time to answer people, even if you're directing them somewhere else that's maybe more suited to them, you still
Mhm.
seem to have the time to do that. And I respect that deeply because not everyone does that. And when I've been trying to find my path, the responses have varied. But anyway, back to the point I was making. How may people best reach out to you to connect with you and find some
Sure.
guidance?
Yeah, I've got a website, awakeningdharma.org, and on there is going to have not only my books, but all the different events I'm offering, whether online or in person. And I would encourage people if they feel the call, particularly if they feel the call toward awakening, opening to the absolute awakening in this consciousness. I have some in-person retreats on awakening that have been quite productive. And on the retreat I did last October, a large majority of the people attending had some form of awakening experience or other. So there is, within the teaching, within the practices, if people feel drawn to it and drawn to working with me, then there is a real possibility of awakening. And I say feel drawn to the teaching and to me, that's important. You need to feel like there's a kind of a tractor beam pulling you in a certain direction. That shows you the sign that you're moving in the right direction when it comes to a teacher or practice. So, and not everybody is the right student for me, or I'm not the right teacher for everyone. I'm certainly aware of that. So if somebody wants a very traditional approach, or they want something different than what I do, there's plenty of good teachers out there they can find. And the folks that resonate with how I teach, it usually works well for them. That's been my observation and their reporting. Well, thanks so much for having me, Liam. I appreciate this time with you and your very thoughtful questions. I'd encourage you to, anytime you want to join one of my day-longs or anything you'd like to do, would be fun to see you.
Absolutely. If there's any recommendations as such that you have for me, I would be very open to them. But for today, thank you so much for sharing this time and this presence with me. I hope I've done justice to your work and to its meaning and the principles that you embody. I really hope so. And I just want to thank you so much for speaking from the heart. It might sound a bit cliche, but just for being such an open book, shall we say, as soon as you write prolifically, for being such an open book today. And I just hope that this is of benefit to many people. It certainly has been of great benefit to myself. So thank you so much once again. Absolutely an honor for me. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I definitely will enjoy
Good.
reading your book as well. This one that you've sent me, but I definitely will look into your others after hearing everything today. So once again, thank you so much. And
You're very welcome. My pleasure. You very well.
listening to you. Thank you. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the Simply Inspired YouTube channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon.